Good morning. How's that? Good morning. My name is James Baroud, and on behalf of the Rothman Institute, Silverman College of Business, and Fairleigh Dickinson University, I welcome you on this very gorgeous yet a bit chilly morning. As many of you know, innovation is a big part of what we do here at the Institute, and it's because of programs like these that we're able to sort of lead the way in educating and inspiring and helping folks nurture innovation at their workplace. Now, 5 years ago, we began this series with Clay Christensen, who gave a brilliant talk and shared his keen insights about disruptive innovation. And today, we continue this series and are delighted to have such a distinguished panel of speakers, including one of Clay's own colleagues and co-authors. Today, we focus on education, an area critical to our collective future, to our young people, and to the future strength of our economy. It is a topic that's especially important to us. We are in an academic institution, and so it's something that we've been thinking about quite actively over the past few years. And I'll mention a couple books that I've been reading, including Disrupting Class, one of the books about disruptive innovation. That was about 2 years old. The Global Achievement Gap was recommended by someone else from ETS, actually, from another innovation summit or conference we had. And just last night, a new book arrived called Weapons of Mass Instruction, just recommended and just released, just recommended by Seth Godin just a couple weeks ago. Seth Godin is a marketing genius, actually, and very forward thinker. So we know that our system is challenged, some say in crisis. Last year, one of the speakers said the system is imploding. Whatever you think, we know we need to improve the system. And that means K through 12, higher education, executive and professional development. I think everyone, or most knowledgeable people, can agree that we need to make some changes. So I hope this morning we can highlight some innovations in this sector, so that we can have a stimulating, perhaps even provocative discussion about this important topic. And so before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors, and particularly BD, Beckton Dickinson, who make this program possible, in addition to all of our other sponsors listed on the screen. So now I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. David Grant is, as many of you know, is president and CEO of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. He assumed leadership in 1998. He is responsible for the development and evaluation of programs in the foundation's major areas of giving, education, the environment, the arts, technical assistance to nonprofits, as well as sustainability. Interestingly, David spent his professional career before Dodge as an educator. In 1983, he and his wife, Nancy Boyd Grant, co-founded the Mountain School of Milton Academy, semester-long interdisciplinary environmental studies program in Vermont for high school juniors. From 1994 to 98, David was a consultant, national consultant to schools, and the leader of workshops on the topics of curriculum and program design, professional development, assessment practices, and school climate. I can go on and on. I won't. David has a very interesting perspective from his long history in this field and as a leader in the nonprofit sector. And I think we're all curious and interested to get his perspective as a way to open this morning and to kick off what I think and hope will be a very stimulating discussion. David Grant.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everybody. You know, you can have all the experience, all the sort of professional educational experience in the world. It still comes down to what happened to you or didn't happen to you in schools as a student, sometimes as a parent. One of our favorite family stories involves our younger son, Rob. It's one of those stories where you don't quite know whether to laugh or cry. he was in first grade at a very small rural school in Vermont. And he had a first grade teacher who was very fond of worksheets. And one day the visiting nurse came and she sat the first grade down and said, talked to them about health and their bodies and their well-being. And then she asked if there were any questions. And so little Robbie Grant raises his hand. She says, yes. And he goes, is it possible to be so bored that you faint? Yeah. So our opinions, we can know things about education, but we also feel things about education based on our own experience. In fact, I love the notion that all opinion in the end is autobiography. So I appreciated that Jim gave you a little bit of my story, just because you'll see where some of my opinions are going to come from this morning. So, what is my experience in relation to these key words of the morning: education, innovation? I would add teaching and learning to that. My own schooling was now feels somewhat anachronistic. I went to the same school from kindergarten to 12th grade. It was an independent school north of Baltimore, best known for its boys choir and its lacrosse team. Not what I would call an innovative education. But I have noted as an adult that I have a deep love of literature and language and poetry that has served me very well at the Dodge Foundation. And I think I know where that came from. I went to a rather traditional college, Princeton University, and then an unconventional graduate program at the University of Michigan. It was one of the very first interdisciplinary graduate programs. I didn't have much of an eye for academic politics, but I did notice what a stepchild it seemed. And even today, when I talk to people in graduate school, the notion of actually getting the disciplines together is somehow frowned upon. It's not pure. I started to work as a teacher, as an English teacher, and then I had the opportunity in my, when I think I was 33 or so, with my wife to found the Mountain School. And Jim mentioned it. That was, I think, it's fair to say, an innovation. It was, we were coming out of the independent school world. I worked at the time at Milton Academy, south of Boston. And I was struck by how little the independent schools used their independence. So we just said, why don't we just create something that doesn't exist now? And it was a semester-long program on a working farm in Vermont for students who wanted to spend half a year, half of the 11th grade year, prime time, actually thinking about and living the issues of, we didn't use the word sustainability at the time. This was early in environmental issues, but it was the issues of sustainability. How do you take care of the land? How do you form a community over time? So I learned a lot. I mean, I think as the morning progresses, you're going to hear from people with a real global perspective. A lot of my thinking about education comes from this tiny hill farm where for 11 years I worked round the clock with a small group of students, not only in an academic way, but in an experiential way about the land and about forming community. I left the Mountain School and had a period of time where I was consulting with schools around the country, and what an eye-opener this was for me. There was a little bit of a idyllic, we're all in it together sense of life at the Mountain School, and here I was on the road working on in-service days with public school teachers on issues that I loved to talk. I just loved curriculum and assessment, instruction, all this stuff. I still have a vivid memory of going to a school in Rhode Island for the day, and there was a room, it was about this size, and I noticed in the back of the room there were 3 teachers who had taken their chairs, taken them to the back of the room, and put them facing the corner, so their backs were to me and to the rest of it, and they stayed there the entire day to show what they thought about the idea of being required to come to that day. Now, their response might be called innovative, but certainly not in the service of anyone's learning. Then I came to Dodge. Some of you, been around New Jersey for a while, and you know the Dodge Foundation quite well, and you know there's a long tradition of funding in education. I would say that it's the through theme had been this sort of notion of creativity and education and a deep interest in the professional development of teachers and principals, having these Dodge fellowships where people, we would literally say to them, what is the professional development experience you've always wanted to do and no school board would ever fund? And so this sort of cadre of trying to have the adults in schools remain engaged and interested and interesting. That, over my years at Dodge, that approach has migrated a bit to students, and our current giving is largely about experiential learning for kids who have been underserved, and in a particular kind of way, which I'll get back to. But I want to pick up on something Jim said about changing the system. If you're in a philanthropy, you know that the great tension of philanthropy is whether you pay attention to what's happening right now, right outside your door, versus your vision of the world as it ought to be 15, 20, 25 years from now. And philanthropy, I think, has a great responsibility to be thinking long term. Yet, the needs are so immediate, and nowhere do we feel this more keenly than in the world of education. We look at teachers and students and we say, how do we serve them? You know, kids grow up pretty fast. So if you miss the opportunity to intervene, to give them some sort of quality and innovative kind of experience, suddenly they're grown up and they missed it. At the same time, systems change painfully slowly, and particularly schools. It's one of the great ironies, right? I mean, schools are in the business of education and growth. Yet they're the hardest institutions to change anywhere. Let me just say parenthetically, as somebody who likes to talk about change, organizational change, that the difference for me from a period of time of working with teachers to working with the leaders of nonprofit organizations was like night and day. When I got to Dodge and started to talk with nonprofit leaders, it was like they were down in a three-point stance saying, help us change, help us get better, help us fulfill our mission. Whereas now we constantly are faced with the notion of outside agencies that have a lot to offer, that want to work with schools, that find them practically impervious. Well, let's try to talk about why. And you know, if you want to be innovative in this sphere, you need to kind of get a grip of what your challenges are. And I would begin with the notion that we collectively have a very fixed mindset about teaching and learning and what it looks like. I heard a story once about this brilliant teacher who had the students all engaged in projects of their own devising. So if you went into his classroom, there were small tables. The kids were just buzzing away in work and critiquing where they were and planning for the future and stuff. And the teacher sort of sitting there at the desk and watching. And the story is that the principal came to observe the class and looked around for a few minutes, and then went over to the teacher and said, I'll come back someday when you're teaching. No, so what does that tell us? Another thing where I think we're very fixed in our mindset is about our use of time. There is a real sense that at any moment at a school, if you just take a picture of it, what should be happening is an adult, a teacher, in a room with a reasonable number of students. The teacher's talking because the teacher's teaching, and the students are taking it in. Now, pedagogy aside, right? The fact that who knows what those students, who knows what's on the mind? Actually, I do know what's on the mind of those students. It's not what's coming out of the mouth of the teacher. But pedagogy aside, let's just think about the use of time in a profession where there really is an outcome for every individual student who spends so much time there. We rarely allow time for teachers to work together to talk about a coherence to their work with students, their curriculum over time. I believe that when we hear the word innovation, we in 2010 tend to think about technology. We tend to think about new stuff. We tend to think about a very kind of creative new frames. I actually feel that the single most innovative thing that could ever happen in any school is simply the reallocation of time for teachers to do the picture the graduate exercise. Some of you know that. Have you heard of that phrase? You know the exercise I'm talking about, picture the graduate? This was Ted Sizer, one of the great iconic school reformers, back in the 1970s, used to talk about this simple exercise where the group of adults who have a group of students in their care over time do the picture the graduate exercise. They say, we've got these kids for 4 years or 5 or 6, however long the school is. They say, when that student leaves us, what will he or she know? What will he or she be able to do? And perhaps most importantly, what attitudes and habits of mind and heart will this student exhibit because we designed our educational program to foster those qualities? Now, it's not that there is a single right answer to those questions, but when schools have answers, they instantly become more effective. You're going to hear later this morning about the notion of 21st century skills. You can't get anywhere. I mean, somebody can write and be incredibly convincing about 21st century skills, but unless the teachers in a school say, I get it, I know what that skill looks like and how you develop it and how we develop it. Students bounce from one adult universe to the next in classroom by classroom, and they never have this sort of sense of coherence in their own growth. I'll give you a quick example. It's very easy to understand. The Mountain School, we designed the Mountain School as around life on this hill farm in Vermont as a place to understand larger systems, larger, particularly environmental interests and issues and responsibilities. And we had a very clear theme, a very clear expectation that when we pictured our graduate, that person was going to be an active citizen. It wasn't just on environmental matters. It was really a sort of a communitarian ethic that democracy's hard, communities have lots of tough decisions to make. You need people, you need thoughtful, informed people willing to work to get to any sort of good outcome. So we said, well, what skills do they need? The knowledge question is over here. I'm not going to go into that right now. But one of the skills we decided they needed was public speaking. Okay, we said, what are we going to do about it? We, all of us. We tackled this time problem at Mountain School head on by having one faculty meeting a week that was all about what kid's in trouble and needs help. Who's driving the van to Hanover on Saturday? Do we have a late check-in on Saturday night because it's Halloween? All that stuff, that endless stuff that you do when you're in a faculty meeting. We had a second faculty meeting every week where no one could talk about vans or students or Halloween. The only permitted topic was the long-term vision of the educational mission of the school and how we were going to implement it. So this gave us the permission, the freedom, and the time to have conversations like this one about public speaking. And we said, okay, what do we need to do? We need to have some sort of oral presentation in every course, and in a couple of them too, so that every student, by the time he or she left the Mountain School, which was only a semester, 4 months long, they had 5 or 6 experiences of public speaking. So we said, okay, they're going to get feedback every time on the exact same criteria. And we simply made this little white sheet that every student became so familiar with that they didn't need it anymore in front of them. 3 criteria. What do you guess they were? Gave them feedback on 3 things. Yes. Eye contact. What else? Pardon me? Volume. Thank you, Susan. And what else? Sorry? No, because we weren't talking about the content. We were talking about the actual delivery. Yes, clarity. In other words, we said 3 things. Speak up. Slow down. Look at the people you're talking to. This is not brain science, right? But you know what it is? It's actually a curriculum design in that by the time they left the mountain school, wherever they started, every one of these kids knew how to speak. And that was now think about all the various things that you can do that with. I've always been amused by schools who do these things called senior projects, where it's supposed to be a culminating event, a culminating educational experience, where the last few months of senior year, the student chooses a question that interests him or her and researches and presents back. And the teachers are shaking their heads and going, these seniors, they're really out the door. There may be some element of the students being ready to leave. But the real problem with those exercises is that the students have never practiced it before. Suddenly, after years of being told what to do, they're supposed to choose their own question. And they're supposed to research when they haven't had a chance to research and then get feedback. So if you want a great senior project, you need to have a freshman project, a sophomore project, a junior project, and learn along the way. It's design and it's coherence, and we're not set up to create it. If teachers and administrators never have time to establish priorities among worthy outcomes for students and plan how to reach them, students will continue to feel they are in a system with no overall coherence and a system that seems designed basically to keep them under control. I think the real reason that school change is hard is that we tinker with everything except what matters most, which is our own mindset. And I believe that part of our problem is that something tells us that if we just approach teaching and learning with the same business-like efficiency with which we approach everything else, that we're just going to be fine, that teaching and learning is not going to be as hard as it seems to be. I think that's wrong. I think what we don't do is actually embrace how hard teaching and learning are and do the right thing, which is, it's funny how in some ways turning to the best of a traditional approach could be the most innovative thing we could do, because the system has made it almost impossible to do now. This is a takeaway for me from Diane Ravitch's new book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System. Anybody read it yet? You'd get real kudos if you did, because it only came out, 10 days ago. But I bet some of you have read about it, right? I hope. Oh, good. A few nods. A few nods. I just need to pause over this, because in the kind of conversation on all levels about school reform and school systems, this book is a bombshell. It's like somebody lobbed a grenade into the conversations, because Diane Ravitch for years was the darling of she was the cheerleader for conservative approaches to schooling and the sort of policies of she was a member of the first Bush administration, and she was an early advocate for No Child Left Behind. She was she supported choice. Sure, yes, charters, yes, vouchers, much more choice the better, competition, like business principles. And then accountability. Well, who would be against accountability? And how do you have accountability with lots of kids? You do these standardized tests of all kinds. Well, here is Diane Ravitch in this book on No Child Left Behind. Basically, she begins the book by saying, I've changed my mind. No Child Left Behind was bereft of any educational ideas. It had no vision other than improving test scores in reading and math. It produced mountains of data, not educated citizens. It ignored the importance of knowledge. It promoted a cramped, mechanistic, profoundly anti-intellectual definition of education. In the age of No Child Left Behind, knowledge was irrelevant. Now, when I say that's a grenade, there are defenders of No Child Left Behind who say, well, let me tell you what Diane Ravitch said. And now they're going, Her book describes her disillusionment with both the choice movement, charter schools, vouchers, etc., and the accountability movement, standardized tests with rewards and penalties, and her opinion that they are undermining public education in the United States. What's more important in her view? Curriculum and instruction. By the way, at Dodge, we sit around constantly saying what needs our attention. And that last one is so obviously true. Instruction. You look at schools around the world, and the highest performing school districts are ones where the teachers are honored. You know the story about the folks in, where was it, South Korea, who are completely bereft if they're viewed not smart enough to become teachers, and they have to do something else. But the way systems are set up, not only to get the highest kind of aspiring professional people into the profession, but the way they are treated themselves and with each other when they're there. So the notion of, well, where would you intervene in this system? Pre-service education and ongoing professional development. But those systems are so incredibly hard to influence with a couple of $1 million that the Dodges of the world tend to go somewhere else. I believe that, well, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Curriculum and instruction. And let's add a third inseparable element to that, assessment, student assessment, or in the words of many educators I admire, authentic assessment. Now, authentic assessment is extremely disruptive to schools, right? Because actually it means that students have to perform. You have to structure your day, your class, your expectations differently. You have to treat students as individuals instead of as a group. Everybody be quiet now and take out the number 2 pencil. And so how in the world, when we got things so fixed and schools are barely under control, can we handle any disruption? Well, let me just mention a few things that Dodge supports and a couple of approaches. One is to simply create new schools. I did that myself with the Mountain School. Rather than try to do some program at Milton Academy or basically we started from scratch with every teacher devoted to the interdisciplinary approach, every student and parent knowing what he or she was getting into. One of the groups that we admire a lot is the Big Picture Company. They're headquartered in Rhode Island. Dennis Littke is the sort of flamboyant educator who is behind it. They now have a network of more than 60 schools in the United States, and it's growing. Daniel Pink's new book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, mentions a few schools in the end, and one of them is the Big Picture Company. What do? They're all about authentic performances. Every student, the Big Picture Company has a school in Camden called Med East, and they have a new school in Newark that they're just forming. Every student, high school, has an apprenticeship outside of the school. And then they come back and take classes, and everything about the classes is designed to help them with the real work of their apprenticeship. Do you imagine how you might listen differently to a writing teacher if you need to produce a memo or an article for the newsletter? Can you imagine how what you need from your math teacher if that's demanded in your apprenticeship? So this notion of a high school diploma being conflated with a certificate of work readiness, and not just being, quote, vocational, but noting that there are demands out there in the workplace that actually need us. They need knowledge, they need skills, they need certain attitudes, and the students don't get it unless they've been in the workplace. So, so here's the big picture company, the big picture company doing that, and these students are being tested, quote, tested by authentic performances in the workplace, not standardized tests. All right, the high schools in Camden last year published the average scores on the SAT. Which school got the highest? Met East. Not a minute spent preparing for the test. The whole time spent on an education that students were deeply involved in. Standardized tests in the world of education have their place. They are things, they can measure things that they can measure. But I think the glaring flaw of standardized tests, it's like the 800-pound gorilla in the world of educational reform, is that they can only pose questions that have right answers. This is a huge idea. They can only pose questions that have right answers. I'd like to ask you grown-ups in this room, how many times a day you're faced with questions that have single right answers? So we've turned to standardization at the expense of standards. And Diane Ravitch makes a good case that we simply lack the energy and the political will to do the hard work of writing standards that reflect choices about what our young people should know. The Picture the Graduate exercise requires choices. It's a hard conversation. Ravitch writes about the effort to create national history standards, which, if there are any historians in the room, they may remember that this was in the 90s, and there was this huge political brouhaha, actually led by Lynn Cheney, because the national history standards basically held Senator McCarthy up as a cautionary tale, and they didn't mention Paul Revere. So if you've got a particular view of your country that you want the history standards to reflect, you're going to enter this whole standards question from a very different standpoint than somebody. Well, I mean, everybody has their points of view here, right? And so it becomes an adult battleground instead of something that actually gives students something to think about. Most standards now, which have been relegated to the states, are almost unreadable because they're so vague about, and they just use verbs and processing terms, and you can process junk and never read a great work of literature and meet the standards in literary arts. Okay, let me say a few words about other choices we've made at Dodge in this regard. For years, we have been the champion of arts education. You want another innovation in schools? Understand the power of the arts. When I go to national conferences with corporate leaders, they get it because they're looking for employees with certain qualities. They describe the qualities nurtured by the arts, the ability to make subtle judgments, to work with others, to design and create things that don't yet exist, let alone the notion of empathy for your fellow colleagues and for the people you serve in a corporate setting. There was a study on empathy. You know, it's sort of a good thing. People like empathetic people. They want to have them work for them. And so they studied, this was a researcher at Stanford, identified empathetic behaviors, studied a whole group of people, said these are the ones, these are high empathy individuals. What do they have in common? You know, the single thing that most of them had in common was some experience in drama. You know, I want to take this even further than empathy. There's another new book out by Stephen S. Hall. It's called Wisdom. Wisdom. And the subtitle is From Philosophy to Neuroscience. Brain science, modern brain science, in a very interesting way, confirms lots of stuff that the ancient philosophers were saying. Wisdom is like the ultimate picture of the graduate, right? My picture of the graduate is somebody who might be young, some young person who is on his or her way to a life that has some wisdom in it. Here's Stephen Hall. Certain qualities associated with wisdom recur in the academic literature. Here's what they are. Check them off for yourself. A clear-eyed view of human nature and the human predicament. Emotional resiliency and the ability to cope in the face of adversity. An openness to other possibilities. Forgiveness. Humility. And a knack for learning from lifetime experiences. When I read that list in the book on wisdom, I was so struck by the fact that it's almost identical to a speech I had heard given by Elliot Eisner, the professor at Stanford, about what the arts teach us. Later in the book Wisdom, we get this line: a great deal of evidence, both anecdotal and empirical, suggests that the seeds of wisdom are planted earlier in life. This is why Dodge supports arts education. I wish school boards across New Jersey and across the country realize that it's not just about keeping kids busy with charming activities in soft subjects. It's about planting the seeds of wisdom. There's one other seed that we try to plant through our educational giving, and that is the seed of an ecological consciousness. It's actually bigger than that. You might call it a sustainability consciousness, and you might argue that we wouldn't be in the global political, economic, and environmental mess we're in today if all of us and our counterparts in other countries had received that sort of education. There's this wonderful essay by a man named Paul Raskin called The Great Transition. At least one of you in the room has read it with me, where he imagines in the year 2084 looking back at the 21st century and describing the transition from where we are now to a global sustainable world. And he says that transition rested on three key shifts of values: from consumerism to a concern with quality of life, from individualism to human solidarity over time, and from domination of nature to an ecological consciousness. He called these values, I would actually call them mental models. And that's why Dodge supports a woman named Jamie Cloud, who runs the Cloud Institute for Sustainability Education, where she insists on two things: that schools and their communities learn together, that students learn best in schools that are located in communities that are learning along with their schools how to create the kind of future that they want together. And then she identifies the mental models that keep us from getting there. The mental model that's being held up to light in book after book right now is the one that was formed by the great burst of 20th century capitalism and growth in America. The growth that more is always better, that growth is good. And it's a very, very hard mental model to shake. In this time of, I'm about out of time, so I'm not going to go into what Jamie does, but I would just, if you note her, the Cloud Institute for Sustainability Education has information on the website about this remarkable game called the Fish Game, which illustrates more quickly and more dramatically the idea of limits and to growth and sustainability than anything I've ever seen. So in this time of fiscal crisis, in this time of where we're shaking our heads about what to do in schools, rather than look too far outward, I would look inward. I would say, let's take time to picture the graduate. Let's focus on curriculum, instruction, and authentic assessment. And let's keep the larger society and the planet in mind, because that's where our students are going to live. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for those very wise words. We have about 9 minutes for some very quick questions and quick answers. So Gabrielle has a mic. Please feel free to raise your hand, and love to get some feedback from David on your thoughts and questions.
Reading in the paper about Bloomberg and his administration's attempt at looking at some of the teachers with a greater tenure and eliminating some of those roles, it echoed a conversation I had with my board yesterday, Board of Ed, about teachers who are sour, teachers who are ineffective, teachers who are there and basically minding their pension and not minding my children. And I think about that, and I was wondering if there's been studies about how do you encourage these people to leave, since you can't necessarily put the dynamite underneath their chair. And then I was thinking, after age 16, they've already been formed, so there's nothing we can really do about them. So I feel hopeless and helpless about reforming them. They don't just, that's my take on it. So I'm wondering, is there any thought or any leadership in that area of trying to encourage these people to move on, or trying to do something different with these people, like Bloomberg's talked about today?
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, and I think some of the later speakers may have some some real data on it. I've been following the sort of Michelle Rhee story in Washington, for example, which John Marrow, Learning Matters, on PBS, has really been following her extensively, and this idea that the most important thing she could do with a district like Washington, D.C. is actually form an agreement with the teachers union that allowed a process to get where the teachers to keep their jobs, they had to demonstrate that they were effective. Now, this is part of it. This is such a complicated system that goes back to the way our whole society actually feels about education. We give it lots of lip service, but there's lots of evidence that America is really an anti-intellectual. What we love are those sort of dashing, innovative captains of industry, and the robber barons. We're not really drawn. Look at candidates have to dumb themselves down, right? And the worst thing you can do as a candidate for office is to appear too smart. So in Washington and in other places, I think that educational leaders are trying to wrest at least some mechanism where it doesn't cost you $200,000, $300,000 to try to retire a teacher who's clearly terrible, right? So I guess I would say it's going on. I think the folks who are going to talk later may have a better news than I. Dodge has always thought, well, you got to get earlier in the pipeline. You got to talk to how teachers are trained. But then and there's some wonderful pre-service, there's some wonderful teacher training programs, but they tend to be small. And the big ones, the big state university ones, are notoriously cash cows for universities. I remember, you said to be short, Jim, I'm sorry. This is just really quickly. I remember this documentary set at Texas A&M that they had an experimental teacher program that put teachers in schools when they were undergraduates and being trained. So they were under the influence of a mentor teacher, they got actual experience, and they came back, and that group far outperformed the other group that was just kind of classroom about, they'd sit in a classroom and learn about classroom management and stuff like that. And Texas A&M dropped the program because it was too expensive. So there are lots of parts of the system that need to be addressed all at once. Anything else? Well, we're right on time.
Well, David will
Thanks again,
stick
everybody.
around. Thank you, David, very
Yeah.
much.